All right, so welcome back. We are at week 2. I noticed already that some people had started making some stuff and dropping it in Slack, so that's really cool to see. I am probably going to pick on a couple people and just have them sort of talk through what they worked on. So if you want to head over to the Slack, we can sort of look at a couple things. Um, I'm just going to share my screen. That way it's sort of recorded. So as people talk, they can share things. So why don't we start at the top here? So Tom, talk to me a little bit about what you made here.
Cool. Yeah. So it's it's from Rhino. It's from Grasshopper, and so in Grasshopper, I don't know if people are familiar with Grasshopper, but a lot of Grasshopper functions with sliders, so number sliders. So you put a number slider into something. So in this case, there's a number slider that's controlling the radii of circles, right? And so the slider, the circles are mapped to the light and dark values of an image. And so when there's a pixel or a point of the image that's really dark, then it's outputting like a really big number. And when there's a circle that's really, or a part of this image that's really light, it's outputting a really small number, or vice versa. And so then this slider controls how big those circles are, right? So then if I animate that slider, so you can right click on the slider and animate it. And it's a very, very basic kind of animation. I mean, it really is awkward and clunky, but it's kind of cool. And so then you animate out at like 90 frames or whatever. And then in Rhino, it just draws those frames to your viewport. You can pick which viewport, top, front, left, whatever. And then it takes the geometry, renders it out. I'm using like a custom material component in Grasshopper to give the lines themselves some thickness and also a color. And then just using a gradient in the window when it renders. And so you see sort of donut. I've been doing a lot of donuts. If people have been following me, you've seen all my donuts. So you get this donut that kind of fades in and fades out. And then that outputs is a series of BMP files, which I then took those BMP files and using FFmpeg, turned those into an MP4, then took that MP4 and flipped the, reversed the speed, right? So made it into something that started big and then, so starts nothing to thing to nothing, right? Then slowed it down a bit because it was running a bit fast, again in FFmpeg, and then put the two together, concatenate, I can't say that word, but it's to join them together. It's called concatenate or whatever. And then outputs it. And then I was planning to then start using the patching thing that we were doing at the end of last week to sort of start messing about with this and sort of zooming in on areas and things. And then I got completely pulled into the hackathon thing, and here and now to go for my life. And I haven't done my homework.
That's fine. No, but I think you highlight that there's, even good. I think you mentioned that it's faster than messing around with Premiere, which I think is, again, there's lots of just pure workflow stuff that you can do with FFmpeg that makes it really powerful. So, yeah, hopefully we
Yeah.
see more with this. Yeah.
One thing I did want to add is, so because I was having a hard time uploading everything to Colab, I installed Homebrew on this laptop because for some reason it didn't have Homebrew on it. And then I downloaded FFmpeg from Homebrew and ran it straight in the command line on my machine. So that's useful, in terms of, obviously you're not getting all the functionality of Colab, which I really appreciate, and it makes a huge difference to the workflow. But I just wanted to highlight for folks, you can run it through command line, through terminal. So
Yeah, totally. And I'll add a link on how to install that. I assume most people on Macs here, so I will install the I'll add the homebrew installation instructions. But yeah, I mean, 90% of these commands that we'll look at in this class will work directly out of the terminal. And it's really just when we start to combine Python and things with stuff that it gets a little trickier. But yeah, that's a great point. And actually, I realized, Sarah, I think you had some work up here a little bit earlier. So if you want to go next.
I just made the grid. I don't have a lot to say about it. I just tried putting it in the grid. I think it's funny with that image because the image is so regular that it's just like slightly off. But yeah, it was fun.
Cool. That's fine. Yeah. And then Alana, talk to us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so what did I do here? Yeah, so I automated the 4x4 grid, and I did a little more work after that to kind of take in, rather than hard coding the 4x4. So I could also do, I went on to do some like 8x8 stuff too. And I found like as I think I tried to do a 20x20 at some point and it just like crashed the whole thing. It was like just too much for Colab. But this one, what I did is I did the 4x4 grid and then I fed the 4x4 grid back into itself. So I got this like weird, like not grid thing happening here. Yeah, so just kind of using it as like an iterative process and like feeding stuff back into itself and separating out the code blocks so that I had the input string as its own code block, and I was randomizing the input string so it would get like repeats of the same crop in there multiple times. So then I could rerun this input string and get a totally different video the next time around. So yeah, I think that's it.
Cool. Yeah. If you haven't gotten a chance, I would definitely recommend like taking a look at the code that Alana wrote here because I think there's some really nice reusable stuff here. I'll highlight that I think, uh, sometimes we think we need to write perfect code in order to like be able to do this like iterative process and it all happens in like one code cell. And most people like if it works and that's what matters. So I think even having a bunch of different cells you can run iteratively and like just play with, I think is really helpful. So I think this is a great example of just like having one simple thing, but then making it just flexible enough to be able to add additional components to it, and then be able to like again render one video, take that video and use it as another input again. Like we'll look at how to like combine all that stuff this week, but don't feel like you need to, right? If it's too confusing, you should feel comfortable just like keeping to rendering one video out at a time and then taking that video and rendering it again. There might be a little bit of compression artifacting in overall, but like who cares? Like at the end of the day, it goes up to Twitter and it gets compressed to hell anyway. So like I definitely think, whatever works for you as you get comfortable with these tools and like stepping through things is like really important. Like I know, James, you mentioned like, oh, I feel like I'm not good at Python, and like it doesn't really matter as long as you can read it, right? Because it's a tool for yourself. So as long as you can read it or like understand how it works and you're able to mess with stuff and variables, like that's all that matters. So I think it's really helpful yeah, I was really excited to see people added some code. I'll try and add some stuff as well, of things that I've been doing. But I think it's really nice to see. So James, talk a little bit about what you did here.
Yeah, so at the end of your bonus video, you had shown something like this, where you randomized several parameters of what you generated. So I tried to achieve a similar effect and try to make the code generalized so that each time you run, it would randomize as much as possible, like the heights of the different rows, as well as the widths of the blocks or the cells within each row. And yeah, so the source video is something I made in Hydra a long time ago, and this code for that particular output video, I think spat out like 390 cells or 290 cells. So it was definitely much more doable as like a dynamically generated filter string code rather than copying and pasting or doing something else. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I'm really excited to see someone do this because it took me probably an hour or two to write it myself. So I think this looks really great. And I also love that like the video you did also sort of highlights like the video being sort of fragmented like rectilinear pieces also makes everything feel more complex as well, which I think is, another interesting side effect of these sort of processes, which is that like your input video also sort of like adds to the feel of if you've got a really random grid, but they're very simple, it's a very simple video, like you're going to mostly show off the grid. If you have sort of a very rectilinear additional elements to your video, then when you play this, you're also getting like that as a feeling in and of itself. So yeah, I mean, so much of this comes down to like video plus effect, having sort of an overall feel for it. So I think it's really great. Chris.
Yeah, I think mine's way more straightforward, but I kind of did a brute force where I just reprogrammed to do 20, the for loop in Python to do 20 slats, vertical slats, and then wrote it brute force for the FFmpeg to randomize it by hand and then assemble it all. So I think there's much smarter ways to do this, and I just didn't take the time to do it yet.
No, that's fine. I think it's great. I think again, even when I find, especially when the video is fairly legible, like, it's not super abstract, like even something like this, you can like, you get that sense of sort of like, I can put it all back together, but even fragmented, it looks pretty interesting.
I was realizing that, doing this exact same thing in After Effects would have taken me, way longer than just doing this. Even the brute force hand coding in FFmpeg and Python was 20 or 30 times faster than doing this in anything else. So that was pretty awesome.
Yeah, no, exactly. I find that like there are certain things that FFmpeg takes longer to do than versus After Effects, but there's other stuff that it takes far less time, and it's just like, it's kind of surprising. It's just always you're never sure like, oh yeah, this actually will be easy in FFmpeg because of the way the tool's built. So and we'll look at stuff like this. So also there's an audit class that sort of is just watching the videos and dropping notes in Slack as well. And Nauko, who's a student who's done a lot of stuff with me, was also posting work from this artist, which has sort of a similar effect. But I think this is using like a little bit of a slit scan technique. So I think there's actually like an offset to the video. So I think next week I might show a quick example of how to do that, because it's fairly simple in FFmpeg because all you're sort of doing is taking a video and just sort of shifting the time per slat. So I think we'll look at some of that next week, because I think it'll be fun to just sort of see that as well. Because this week we'll be focusing mostly on video filters, and then we'll look at the complex filter as a way to sort of tie everything together. So I do want to come back and include look at a little bit more about how to shift time, how to shift position, like those sort of things. So we'll definitely cover that in the next couple weeks. But I thought this was really cool. I added a bunch of like links to artists who I think you can maybe get some inspiration from. This is if you go to the syllabus for class, down here I've sort of added a couple artists who I think whose work you should check out. So I think the first and foremost, like Greg Bierman, his work is probably like the most immediately like recognizable as a way of thing you could do with FFmpeg, because he uses a lot of videos that he sort of like puts into multiple positions, and then the audio is also sort of like using the audio overlapping as sort of this crazy sonic effect. So I think his work like you'll immediately sort of connect to. Martin Arnold is a little bit harder, but I'll say like I think I want to do some of his stuff or something that he's done a little bit more next week. So dealing with time. And a lot of his early work, maybe less of his like newer work, but his early work was basically taking old films and sort of stretching them out into like really long sequences by doing a lot of reversing and restarting and like chopping up the sections and like repeating them over and over again. So we might look at some stuff of his work, like or a way to sort of get to like partly his work next week. And then Holly Fisher is just another like video artist who I think does a lot of interesting work, but a lot of overlays, blend modes, those sort of things. So I think again we'll probably look at some of that next week as well. So I would definitely recommend checking out some of these artists. If you know of other artists whose work you think is in a similar vein or could maybe be done in FFmpeg, or you're just like, hey, could we try to do this in FFmpeg? We could definitely look at that. So I think there'll be a lot of fun to sort of take a look at that. Yeah, so definitely some cool stuff. So really excited to see everybody working. Again, it's not like you're required to drop homework in Slack. Like everyone has busy day jobs and other things going on. But I do find that if you do get to drop stuff in there, it's nice and people always are getting excited, or maybe they can take your work and sort of expand upon it. So I'll try to do the same a little bit this week as well. All right, I didn't miss anybody, did I? Okay, cool. So let's dive into this week's lesson. So I actually have no notes. Oh, one thing I do want to note is co-working sessions. So it turned out Mondays at noon Eastern Standard Time are the best times for everybody. This week is, for the Americans, that's Memorial Day. So I'll still do it because I'm just hanging out. So I'll send out a calendar invite. If people can't make it, I might also do another one for Wednesday at noon, just because I know that that was a time that was sort of the second favorite. So I'll send out calendar invites for both of those. Again, those are optional time periods. If you have an idea for a project, you're just working through something and are stuck, if you want to attend and just like pick my brain or ask me questions, we can walk through stuff. So that's noon Eastern Standard Time. So I'll send out invites for those this week. So, and usually what I'll do is I'll just drop a note in Slack and say like, hey, if you are planning on attending, like just give me a thumbs up. That way I know if no one is planning on attending, I won't show up and just hang out by myself. So I'll drop notes on that for folks this week. Okay, so I'm going to copy the link to this here and drop it in for everybody. I don't really have any slides because we're going to walk through these notes together, and hopefully the notebook itself are the slides for this week. But this week we're going to mostly look at video filters. So video filters being, we started a couple of these last week. We started looking at the scale filter, a couple other filters. So this week we're going to focus on, okay, I have an idea for something. Where do I go to find a video filter? How do I figure out how it works? That sort of thing. And then we'll also spend a little bit of time about looking at the complex filter graph. Obviously, we looked at that a little bit sort of at the very end of class last week as a way to sort of put all of our patches together. But this week we'll look at how to like sort of read it and understand it and break it down into pieces. So that way we can begin to sort of build up a really interesting sort of project for ourselves in a single FFmpeg cell. All right, so I have already uploaded a video. It's just this test.mov. So again, it's pretty short. It's actually this one, I just renamed it. It's pretty short, pretty small, and I've already uploaded it to Colab. And I just ran a test here to make sure it worked real quick. One thing you might find as you go through the filters is that the version of FFmpeg in Colab is slightly out of date. I find that FFmpeg doesn't update that often, but I don't think in this lesson, but I do think maybe in later lessons, there will be a filter or two we will use that is out of date. This code will allow you to update FFmpeg. So if you run this, you'll see we've got 3.4.8. I believe FFmpeg is something like 4.3 is the latest version now. So if you run this cell, this will actually update it.
But this updates it for the whole notebook. Is that the idea?
Yeah, so I mean, notebooks are just a server environment. So what it's going to do is it's going to run, it's going to update the server essentially with the latest version of FFmpeg. And it doesn't take too long to run. I think it takes, maybe it probably is going to take a handful of minutes. I have never found a filter that was basically like obsolete. So using the latest version never really like breaks anything. It will just always upgrade you to the latest. And again, I haven't really found too many filters that don't work with the version that's installed that comes pre-installed on Colab. But if you do, for whatever reason, run into something and you're like, Googling around seems like I'm out of date, then you might want to just update this to the latest. So that just finished running, so it took 2 or 3 minutes. and you'll see now we're at 4.3. So again, I don't think anything in this lesson requires an update. I just thought it would be helpful to add this here in case people want it or need it. This probably will, I assume this will also work for anything local in terminal. Again, I'm always a little wary to upgrade to the latest thing, although I feel like FFmpeg is fairly backward compatible. But if you know one of your tools is using a specific version of FFmpeg, you might want to be a little bit more careful with that. But I think especially in Colab, it's fine because we nuke these environments pretty much every time we're done. So it won't have any effect on anything. So I'm not on the latest version. You don't need to, but if you want to, you can. All right, so video filters. So filters are basically the bread and butter of FFmpeg. It's that middle layer between inputs and outputs. It's pretty much how you do everything inside of FFmpeg. So the way to get access or to look and see all the options that are available in your version of FFmpeg is to just run the -filters command. So go ahead and run this. And you'll see you get it spit out a ton of different commands. So let's talk about what this sort of like table is doing. So along the left-hand side here, you'll see there are things T, S, and C. Basically, those stand for different levels of how you can use tools. The T stands for timeline. We'll look at this a little bit later, but the timeline support allows you to turn filters on and off based on the time in which the video is playing. So basically say you want to run a filter only from 5 seconds to 20 seconds. If you see the T next to this filter, that means you can run that. Now, there's probably other ways to hack around that using like a Python environment, but we'll look at how to do this in more fully fledged features a little bit later. But it's helpful to know that like it's a really powerful tool if you can use the timeline editor. S stands for thread slicing. We probably won't get into threading too much here because we're mostly dealing with short videos. If you are really interested in multi-threading and or thread slicing, knowing what tools are available for slicing is important. I kind of understand how slicing and multi-threading are different, but also not really. So if you're really interested in multi-threading, I might have you Google just like thread slicing and how it works. My rudimentary Googling of things seemed it was a little confusing, but we can figure out if you're interested in it. And lastly, the C stands for command support, which means there's a single argument option that can be used outside the video filter. So a lot of times when you Google stuff, you will see someone using the command option rather than the VF filter. So one way to think about this is, let's see, there's a set points filter in here, right? So there is a filter called set points. Set points actually allows you to set the speed of something. Interestingly enough, it says it doesn't have a C filter, but it definitely does. Interesting. Well, FFmpeg documentation isn't always the best, but usually what you'll see is a lot of people will do something like FFmpeg input is test.mov, and then they'll do some like set points equals 0.5 times PTS, and then your output video would be test 2x.mp4. We'll cover time and stuff a lot more later, probably next week actually. But this essentially says speed up my video 2x. So you can write it this way, or you can also write it this way, which is if you stick this in a VF filter, this is the same thing. So I believe, now I'm like questioning myself if I got the C right, but essentially anything that has a C next to it should have the argument option as well as this option. Now, honestly, like I just find it easier to think, well, if it's in a filter, I can use the VF filter. Oh, this is wrong, -VF. So that just makes sense to me. So, trying to remember like the dash arguments and which ones exist and which ones don't seems kind of silly. I'm sure there's probably some reason, maybe it's more for performant or something. But essentially, like I just recommend sticking all these inside of VF filters instead of video filter. So that's sort of what these things along the side mean. The next important thing to understand is this sort of what's going on in the middle here, which is A arrow A. So you can probably guess this means audio in to audio out. And you'll see in other cases where there are double A in to A out. And that means it requires 2 audio inputs to get to 1 audio output. Set points cutting the number of frames in half. Not exactly, although it kind of does in the way it outputs, because your frame rate stays the same. PTS stands for, oh shoot, I'm gonna mess this up. Something about timestamps. But essentially what you're doing is you're moving all of the keyframes in half. So it basically does say you're cutting the number of frames in half, but it results in a faster video. So it isn't changing the frame rate, like going from 24 to 12. It's saying keep it at 24 frames, but then just like, yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah. So we'll cover a lot more about, that was maybe not my best example, but it was just one I knew offhand. We'll cover more of that next week. But yeah, PTS allows you to change the time, the speed of things. So back to this, you'll see that there are cases where there are double A to A. That just means you need 2 inputs to get to an output, and this is a crossfade. So obviously you need 2 audio files where you're crossfading across them to actually get to 1 audio file. You'll also see cases where the N exists. N means multiple inputs. So that can mean any number of inputs. So you could have 20 inputs here, and that would single out to 1 audio file, which is a mix. You'll often find, although it's not always true, that audio filters have an A in front of them, just to denote that they are audio filters. But even as you get down here, you'll find that that kind of breaks down, right? Because like chorus, apparently there's an, oh, interesting. Oh, apply a headphone cross. Okay, anyway. Yeah, so there, sometimes A stands for A audio, but it doesn't always. So it does start with audio here. And then once in a while you get down here to video. So there are, once again, you'll see video where there's a 2 video input to a single video output, where you'll see N to V. Let's see if H stack or V stack is here. So we used H stack last week to actually stack our videos, or like put them in a row. And you'll see here it takes an N, right? We could feed it as many videos as we wanted. And it spits out to 1 single video. So this is sort of like, if you just want to quickly look for a filter or you forgot the name of it, this is how you can do that, right? So you can just go through here and sort of be like, I think it was something like, was it H stack or was it horizontal stack? I can't remember. So you can sort of quickly look through here. There is also, and I have it down here at my notes, at the very bottom of this page, there is also the filter documentation page, which is not the FFmpeg all that we looked at yesterday or last week. This is just every filter that's available. So I usually put these 2 in combination with each other, right? I might come here and look at the filter output and just sort of be like, oh, this sounds interesting. This description also sounds interesting. What exactly do I do with this? And then you'll come in here and you'll go, okay, let me find H stack. And then if you click on H stack, it will explain, usually in better detail, but not always in better detail, how it works, right? So this actually has no examples, so it's not as much fun as you might think. Some of these are a little bit better. We will look at the Hue one in just a minute, and you'll find there are actually good examples here. So, you know, there are just different, it's just worth knowing that like there's different places to go to find this stuff, and they won't always be.
I mean, there's a chance we could make it to that pizza place.
Stefan, I'm trying to mute you. I don't know how to. Here we go. Let's see, mute.
So sorry.
No worries. Yeah, so just know that this is sort of like you can use these 2 pages in tandem with each other. Yeah, so that's pretty much how I look for filters. A lot of times it's either I want to do something specific, or I'm just like digging around and being like, oh, what looks fun in here? Let me find a new filter to play with. And sometimes you'll find them here. Sometimes you'll find them going through the filter documentation. You know, obviously the biggest challenge is this is a very long page. You will scroll forever. So I do find that just dumping the filter command here is a little bit quicker. and it will help you sort of see the overall filters here a little bit better. And obviously, if you've used Photoshop or After Effects before, many of these names will look familiar, and you'll be able to sort of be like, oh, I bet I know what that does. So for example, there was a Sobel filter here. So there's a Sobel filter here. So if you ever use Sobel, that's what edge detection. So it'll add, that'll probably create some sort of edge feature with this. There's stuff like Smart Blur. I believe there's also a Gaussian blur. Yes, there are generators as well. So one thing to note is that, where was it? Oh yeah, so there's a Mandelbrot, there's a fractal generator. I believe there's also a number of audio visualizers built in here. I'm trying to remember what those names were. I will have to find one, but there are also audio visualization tools in here. So there's a lot in here, and this is sort of what's fun is like when you go through here and look, you'll see like, oh man, there's so much stuff. Oh, here we go. So there's drawing graphs using audio data. There's a vector scope. So that'll do, I guess, the sort of like cool vector scopey things. So there's a lot of stuff to play in here, which is why, this can't be, why this is only a 4-week class, and we will cover a very small portion of all the filters that are available. So I highly recommend this week just going through here and just like maybe picking 1 or 2 of them that sounds cool, going over to the filter documentation and seeing if you can figure it out. And if you can't, drop a note in Slack and maybe we can figure it out together, or show up to a co-working session. We can walk through it together as well. Because I do think there's a ton of stuff in here. And so much of it is probably poorly documented, which means if we can document it better, then everyone can use it. It's always a fun part of this class. So that's like the overall idea of how video filters work. One other note is that if you are going to use an audio filter, the way you usually have to do this is you will do FFmpeg -I, and you'll give it your input. And let's say that this input had an audio source. This particular one doesn't. You'll use VF for any video filters, and you'll use AF for any audio filters. So make sure that you don't try to stick audio filters inside your video filter, because it will ignore them. I believe you just do like, I think with the video filter, the single filter graph, you don't need to map anything. We'll look at mapping in just a second. But essentially, like this is how you filter on your video as well as on your audio. So this gets kind of complicated when you're trying to chop up video, because then you also have to chop up your audio in the exact same sequence. So it can get kind of annoying. This is probably where maybe After Effects would be easier if you have specific needs that you're doing. But overall, I think this is a pretty interesting tool, and there's lots of stuff you can do within each of these. So just be aware that you do have to use the AF filter for itself. All right, so let's look at one of the examples of using one of these filters. So let's look at hue cycling. So if you come up here, you'll just see, let's say you're just like, oh, I want to change the hue of my video. Is that an option? So you'll see here that there is a hue filter, and it says adjust the hue and saturation of the input video. So you're like, okay, that sounds great. So come over here and let's come, I guess we'll go down a little bit. I'm already close enough. No, I'm not. Okay, let's go back up to the top. Let's do File, Hue, and we'll click here. And lo and behold, we're lucky enough that this particular one happens to have examples, and it also has commands. So this is really, really helpful just to know that like, I can probably read this one and understand what's going on. One funny thing about the hue command is that the hue command controls not only hue, it also controls saturation and brightness. For whatever reason, they never describe brightness here. We would probably think about this more as the HSB filter in Photoshop or in After Effects. But in FFmpeg, it's just called hue. So I've went ahead and documented sort of the more important parts of this. I sort of compressed what is on this page down into the very smallest parts. So if you've ever used HSB filters in Photoshop or in After Effects, you know that the hue is usually like a degrees, right? There's like a rotation element you can apply to it. So with this value, there's 2 ways you can do hue cycling. So one is with a lowercase h, and the lowercase h means you're using a degrees input. If you use the uppercase h, that means your hues are in radians. And I'm sure maybe a couple of you in here are better at radians than I am. I tend to stick to degrees. Converting that in my brain is not fun. But depending on what you're interested in doing, you can do one or the other. So in this example here, we're going to just, what we're going to do is we're actually just going to take our hue from our video and just flip it. So we'll do 180-degree rotation. 180-degree rotation. So that just says we do hue equals H equals 180. So this is 180 degrees. So we'll just run the cell. And I've got to overwrite my video here because I already had this. Cool, so that ran. While I download that, I'm gonna run this next one. So this is hue with a capital H, and we'll set it equal to pi, which I believe is the same thing. I think pi in radians is 180, is that right? Yep, cool, so we'll run this. And while that runs, we'll download this video. And there you go. So you'll see this video, the hue, basically any value between black and white has been shifted 180 degrees. So this is what the video was before. So it was very warm before, and now it's very cool. And if we download the Pi version, this should be the exact same video. Yeah, there we go. So again, if you're a radians person, you use capital H. If you're a degrees person, you use H. This will also come in handy when we look at how to tie this to a time, because you might want to do stuff in radians, or you might want to do stuff in degrees. It's kind of up to you. So saturation. So saturation takes in, I believe in Photoshop and in After Effects, it's 0 to 100, or like negative 100 to 100. In FFmpeg, the value is negative 10 to 10. The default is 1. And this took me about 30 minutes to figure out this week, last night. 0 is grayscale. So for whatever reason, there's like a cycling effect on this as well, where if you 1 to 2 is apparently like also saturation, but also going negative is also saturation. This isn't like, this does not make sense to me. I'll have to look into what this actually means, but just know that the default is 1, which means no change, and 0 is then grayscale. If you crank it to negative 10, you will get another very oversaturated video. No idea why that is the case that it is, but that's what it is. So if we come down here and we run this cell, this will convert my video to black and white. But I should note it's not official. It's not actually black and white, right? It's not a one-channel video. It's actually still RGB. It's just we've desaturated all the colors. And while I download this one, let's look at brightness. So brightness, again, takes a range of negative 10 to 10. In this case, the default is 0. And in this case, I actually got what I expected, which is if you crank it to negative 10, you essentially get a black video. So this actually does work. I don't know. This one doesn't work the way I expect it to. This one does. So in this case, we'll run negative 5, which will make the video overall darker. So let's take a look at our desaturation version. So there we go. So this is grayscale. And so we go. It's darker. It's actually quite dark. But that is with a negative 5. So I would imagine negative 10 is going to make it straight up black. Chris, I'm so glad you asked. Thank you for setting me up for my next demo, which is if you want to chain these, then you would do this. So let's say we want to keep it 180. So we'll actually just copy this command. And because this is all the same filter, what you're going to add is you're going to add a colon, and then you're going to do the next variable. So how this works is the actual filter you're going to use goes first, and then you do equal, and then you do the first argument assignment, and then you do the next argument assignment. Instead of using an equal sign, you use the colon. So we'll use b equals 5. So this is going to be hue 180, and let's make this a little bit brighter. Let's go negative 2. So we'll do hue and make this dark. So here we go. We have a slightly darker, cooler temperature video. We will look and just slightly like how to chain multiple filters together. I'll cover that a little bit toward the end of this session. But for now, just know that if you have anything where you're using this the same argument for the same filter, you're going to just use equal first, and then anytime after you use the colons. Any questions about the hue filter? All right. So the next thing you might be wondering is, well, this is a cool value, but what if I want to do something like hue cycling, right? So in like After Effects, you would set your little stopwatch, start it at 0, and then you would do like 360 to the other part. So that's actually very easy to do inside of FFmpeg. What we're going to use is the t variable. So the lowercase t variable stands for the time in our video. So as the video is playing, it's keeping track of how far along into the video it is, and the t variable is going to equal what that is. So FFmpeg almost is always based in seconds, and the t variable uses seconds. So when you are at 1 second into your video, the t variable is going to be equal 1.0. Let's say you're at a minute and half a second in, your t variable is going to equal 60.5. You can do modulo-like stuff. It's a little bit trickier. This is where I think we might cover doing this using a the timeline. So I'll show how to do stuff like that in just a minute. I don't know if there's officially a modulo effect in FFmpeg, but we can look through it. I've sort of set toward the end of this lesson, I've got a bunch of the evaluator expressions, so we can look through those. I don't think there's officially a modulo, but there's probably ways to do it in a different way. So for now, let's just look at just straight up using the t command. So what we're going to do here is we are going to take the t command and we're going to multiply it by 90, and then we're going to apply that to the lowercase h variable. So what this is going to do is every second, it's going to rotate 90 degrees. And this is continuous, right? So t is a floating point number, meaning if you're let's say it's a 24 frame per second video, at 1 frame in, you're still going to get a value that is sort of continuous, right? So it's never just going to jump from 1 second to 1 second to 1 second. So this will be a continuous value, which means it's going to cycle every second 90 more degrees. Let's go ahead and run this. Oops, and I named my file wrong. Change my file name. There we go. So we're color cycling, right? So I guess every 4 seconds it should return back to sort of where the color that it was before, which looks about right. So this will essentially, because it's how long is this? 8 seconds. This will do 2 almost continuous cycles of color. One of the challenges I do find with T is T has no sense of how long your video actually is. So if you want to do something like, I want to go continuously from here to here in a full loop or something, you kind of have to do that math yourself. As far as I can find, there's no way to sort of say like, do this over the length of my video. In part because of the way that FFmpeg encodes. It encodes sort of linearly. So it encodes up and it like just keeps moving forward until it like finishes. It doesn't actually know what the end is until it gets there. So some of this we'll look at some examples of this a little bit later in class, but like you kind of have to know how long your video is in order to sort of target things correctly. So this again is where probably Python comes into play, right? You want to actually be able to set a variable that says like, hey, my video is 8 seconds long. So therefore like do all this stuff, calculate what that filter should actually be, and then apply that in a filter string that way. So that's one of the challenges with T. In general, it's a bigger challenge of FFmpeg as a whole, just because of the way it encodes video, it never knows how long a video is until it's done. So Stefan's question is, do you recommend thinking in seconds or in frames? It's kind of dependent. We'll actually look at both examples. There is also an end filter or an end variable, and N stands for frame count. So you can think in frames or you can think in seconds. FFmpeg kind of is okay with either. But I don't know, it's just dependent on what you want to do, right? Like thinking in T is helpful because then your video input can have any frames per second value, right? Whereas if you are thinking about n frames, it is specific to like frames per second or like how long do you want this thing to animate over. So you kind of have to think in both, or like it just depends on what you're doing. Yeah, so it's like one of the challenges of these tools is just like, okay, what mode do I need to think in and how do I apply that? So we will look at using the n variable toward the end of class because I think there's some cool ways to tie that together. Any questions about the t variable? Okay, I have one more thing to cover before we do a break, and that is timeline support. So if you remember, I talked about at the beginning here that anything that has a capital T in our video filter list, if we go back here and go to hue, we'll see this has a T in front of it. That means there is a thing called timeline support. And what timeline support means is in this case, what we're saying is just take where we are in the video and apply this variable to this value. So basically, like, take the time value and use a multiplier or some other effect. So this changes over time. But let's say I only want to do a hue change between 1 and 2 seconds. That would require a whole bunch of like math to like probably do like and or binary operators to make this like not work. That's pretty annoying. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to use the timeline support, which is this enable filter or enable argument. So you might see enable in multiple filters, and that just means that if enable is shown, that means that this T setting is here. So there are some videos that cannot take a T. Usually if it doesn't involve time, it just won't do it. Like with HStack, like there's no reason to say like only enable this during this period of time. So the enable filter takes again an operator, and there's a ton of operators. The operators are all listed here. I see commonly people use the between operator the most. What this says is between, and then you pass it in one of your variables. So in this case, I'm saying seconds. So I want to say enable a hue shift of -90 degrees between 1 second and 2 seconds. So when 1 second to 2 seconds is running, only turn this on during that time. Let's go ahead and take a look at this and just run it. I'm going to run into this issue all day today because this is an MOV file, not an MP4. I'm just going to update these before I run into that issue again. That probably would have been the smarter thing to do, Sarah. But, not there yet. Okay, so here we go. So here we saw, up until 1 second, it was my normal video. When it hits 1 second, I don't know how QuickTime reads times, but I'm going to assume this is correct. At 1 second, it switches on, and at 2 seconds, it switches off. So this uses the between filter, or sorry, the between expression. There are a number of these operators here. So I think, David, this is where you were asking about, is there modulo? I don't believe there is a modulo, but let's see what does exist here. So you can't use pixel locations for between, I don't believe, because these are mostly time operators. So what you would probably want to do is, if you wanted to like do pixel locations, you're probably better off setting that inside of Python and being able to use Python to look at that. So we'll look at an example, I think at the very end of class, where we use Python to like automate some of these variables and using one of these timeline features. So here are the list of all the expressions that you can use that are built into FFmpeg. So you'll see there's quite a number. There are some if and if not filters, or if not expressions. You'll also notice that there's sine and cosine in here, which we'll use at the very end of class because there's some cool things you can do with sine and cosine. Min and max become pretty important. You'll see a lot of examples using those. Oh, there is a modulator. So there is a mod, so you could probably try and play with that and see if that works. Yeah, so there's a ton of stuff here. Again, this is one of those things where it's like I have not played with every one of these, so I'm sure like there's some really fun things we can do with this. This is like one of those things where like once you see this, you're like, man, FFmpeg has so much going on with it, and people just use it to convert video formats, right? Like there's so much you can do in here, and instead people are just like MOV to MKV, I'm done, you know, or like change the size of my video. But there's so much else that can be done in this tool that we just haven't really explored all of the potential for it. So I think there's lots of cool things to play with, and maybe this week you'll play with a couple of them. Okay, so this is how to use the timeline filter. Now you might also be saying, well, what if I want to do multiple timelines, or if I want to use between, let's say I want to do a -90 between both 1 and 2 seconds, but then also between 4 and 5 seconds, right? That feels like a pretty common thing. So there's probably a couple ways you could do this, and I have no idea which of these is the most performant. One thing you can do is you can actually chain your filters together. So this is actually like 2 different filters, but they're all being enabled using different enablements, or like different turning it on and off, right? So this would be a good example where, like, let's say I want it to be -90 between 1 and 2 seconds, and then I want it to be +90 between 3 and 4 seconds. Just adding a comma in here, you can chain a number of video filters together. So this could also be, you could also add scale in here as its own other video filter. This seems kind of, if this were to both be -90, I would say this is like not very like simple code, right? Like this feels pretty chaotic. So I looked around to figure out other ways to do this, and it actually turns out this isn't documented anywhere, but I found out it works. You can just use the plus filter, or like just add an operator here. So if you say between time of 1 and 2 plus between 3 and 4 plus between 5 and 6 plus between 7 and 8, this works. I have not seen this documented anywhere, so that's cool. So this works, and I would assume, again, I don't really understand how FFmpeg performance works. I would assume maybe this is more performant than this, but don't quote me on that. So this is a cool way to sort of chain these things together without writing additional sort of code or like additional lines of stuff. So this is fun. I recommend, definitely recommend playing with this. You could also try tying this to time, right? So if you tie this to a time variable, times -90, one thing to note is that this is actually going to be, or actually, I guess you would do this down here. If you do this down here, depending on how depending on your timings, I believe this is going to lead to different results for every position in the seconds. I think, let's make this 45, and then we will definitely get that result. So this is now like really expressive because you're saying in time, take the time variable and do something different with it at every one of these cycles, right? So you can start to chain these things in a way that's really, really interesting together. Yeah, so Stefan, I think that this is like you just use the add, and like enable figures out what to do with it. I tend to find that FFmpeg is like pretty good in the sense that you just throw something at it, it's like, cool, I can figure that out, which is very nice. And if it doesn't know what to do with it, it'll tell you. So there's like very helpful error logging. One of the challenges is that I don't believe you can really you can't really print T, right? Like you can't really print it to the console to see what values you're getting. It's kind of like you have to try to figure it out. I guess maybe if there's a way to print text, you could probably, there's like shaders, right? You'd have to print it to the actual output to sort of see it. So this is a lot of fun. I definitely recommend playing with this. We will go into much greater detail in using the timeline support at the very end of this class, because there's some really cool stuff you can do with some filters that are a bit less flexible. So any questions about using these so far? All right, if there are no questions, let's take a quick 9-minute break. So we'll come back at 10 after, and we'll go through a couple other things. All right, see everybody in a couple minutes. All right, hey everybody. So during the break, there were some questions in the chat, which I thought were really interesting and are things that I've thought about exploring and I've never just hunkered down and did it. So Chris was asking about how to, if we could actually use like the T filter. I think what you're saying is, can we use the T filter to create a dynamically sized crop? Is that right? Yeah. So let me show. So ignore, we're going to talk about what this means and you'll be able to understand a little bit of this more in like 10 or 15 minutes. But for now, focus on this, which is like, we're trying to take a video and we're trying to crop it. And if you remember, the crop filter takes in X, Y, or I guess width, height, X and Y, right? So what I'm trying to do with this video is I want the width of the video to expand over time, right? So at 0 seconds, it should be nothing. At 10 seconds, it should be 10 pixels wide. So I was hoping this would work. And actually, I'm wondering if this is maybe the issue. I'm just going to make it 10 pixels to start with, and then it expands 1 pixel per second. This should throw an error when I run this. Let's see. Oh, hold on a second. Let me give it a new name here. Yeah, this will give you an error. And the reason is it'll say, I don't know how to deal with T plus 10. So one thing I did when I checked before we got too far into this is that I looked at the crop documentation, and crop documentation does have a T as an option, but it does not let you work on animating the width of the video. I think that's because this actually generates a video of a fixed size in the buffer. So like you can't have a animating size to work with. So that's the challenge there. What it is cool is you can use T, however, to animate the position. So this is the same code. And instead what I'm doing is I'm keeping a block of 100 by 100. And what I'm doing is I'm actually animating the video inside of that block up. So this does work. And if you look at this, this is what it ends up producing. So see, it's animating the video inside that crop. So this is a case where T is allowed to work in some places and not in others. So this is kind of the thing. I think there's probably a way we could do this with Python, using Python and FFmpeg together, but we'll have to sort of see when we get to that step. So this is a cool idea, and this is the challenge of like trying to figure out the FFmpeg documentation, because it's never clear about exactly what you can and cannot do with things. So this is a case where T can work in some places in crop, but not all of them.
Yeah. Conversely, can you do where you black out everything except for like a slice?
Yeah, that would probably be the other way to do it. I definitely want to cover. Man, I've got so much to cover next week. I want to cover masking for sure, because masking is another thing where that's probably how you would actually do it. You would create a mask and then you would animate the mask, and show what's behind that way. That won't. I think what Sarah was discussing, which is like if you were to do that with a bunch of H stacks, like how could you animate that? I think we'd have to figure out a different way to do that with HStack. But yeah, you could potentially like sort of operate that. I actually think HStack would require a complex filter and some Python, but I think you could do it. So we'll maybe take a look at that. Not in this class, but I'll like maybe think about it for this week and maybe add some code for that. Yeah, so T is like a really powerful tool, but you have to be careful where you can use it and where you can't. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to show really quickly is we looked at rotate last week, and we looked at rotate in 90 degrees, right? It was only like rotate once 90 degrees, another 90 degrees, that sort of thing. There is a rotate filter inside of FFmpeg that will take any value. But what you have to remember with rotate is that if you have a square video and you're rotating, what happens to the edges, right? Are you zooming out? Are you coloring the edges? How do you operate with that? And that's one of the challenges of rotate. I stole these directly from the documentation, but there are two sort of big picture ways in which you could deal with rotation, right? The first is if you're rotating, when you hit about 45 degrees, that should be like essentially your widest point in the video, and that will give you the width. So rotate has an output width function, which says like how wide should I make my video, and also an output height function. So if you see OW and OH, that means what should the output width and output height be. So this code, which I'm sure if I really sat down and like thought about it, does hypotenuse of the IH and IW and IH, which I assumed is just like gets you the widest point, right? It gets you the widest angle of that. That's probably like just SOHCAHTOA stuff. So this will basically say like, hey, when the video is at its like widest, like when the rotation is at its widest or tallest point, make the whole video that size so that everything fits in the video viewport. So that's what this is doing. So OH or OW determines what that output should be. And then we're just setting OH to exactly the same as OW. One thing to note about FFmpeg is FFmpeg, I believe, requires all of your dimensions of your video to be powers or like a multiple of 2. So you can't have an odd sized output. So oftentimes you'll get a weird error message. I forget exactly what the error message is. We might see it later, of something where like, 735 doesn't work as an output size. So the hack for me, there's other hacks, but like I just add +1 or -1 or whatever when that comes up. There's other things you might see in the FFmpeg examples of like doing some sort of like other expression to make sure it's a power of 2. It might even be a modulo function even, but basically like that's what this +1 is there for. The last thing is C. C is for what do I do with the background color, right? Because if you're rotating a crop, like there's some background. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ian. Width not divisible by 2. So that's just adding 1 will usually fix that for you. So the C is what color should I make the background? So this is, I believe, blue. So this is a hex code, right? So you just put in the hex code plus OX. You can also do an alpha channel. So if you want it to be, I guess, transparent, you could do like 7.7. So it will accept transparency. One note about transparency is if your output format does not support transparency, it'll flatten it. So I don't think MP4s support transparency. So don't play with that in this format. Obviously, when you start to like overlay it, it can usually handle that. But if you set something like this to be an alpha channel, it'll probably just flatten it and smush it to like a grayish color. So just be aware of that. So let's go ahead and run this and just take a look at it. Oh boy, here we go again. Sarah's gonna yell at me more.
I don't yell, I politely suggest.
with a smirky emoji, yes. Okay, so let's see if this works now. Cool, so there we go. So this is our video rotating fully in space, and using that that hypotenuse code, we're able to make sure that our width and our height don't crop in on anything. Now the code below this is using the min expression, right? So it says what's the min height or min width. That's pretty easy. So we're going to set this to be the min. So this is going to crop in on everything. So it's never going to show an edge. So it's going to let us rotate the video, but it's going to crop in a lot. So here again, and this time we set the background color to none because we don't need it. It shouldn't be shown at all. So if we run this, it actually looks like I already ran it, and we download this.
Why did you have to provide the background color if it's none?
I think it'll take a default. So I just noticed in the examples they said none. Maybe maybe it's like a performance thing or something. You probably don't need to, but it just seemed like the examples do it. So here we go. So now we're rotating and we don't see any edges, but it did crop into our video quite a lot. So that's rotate. I think it'll be fun to play with this version of this as we begin to, we're looking at how to stack video on top of each other. I think it'd be fun to play with using this and stacking. You might be able to create some really interesting like sort of rotations as things stack over each other. So maybe take a look at this code and play with it a little bit more. And as I mentioned before, if you want to combine multiple video filters, like you're taking the same video and you're just going to apply different filters to that same video input, you can use multiple filters by just adding in a comma. So this is, again, this is just in Colab or in Terminal, you can use these, whatever these ticks are, forward ticks, back ticks, whatever which one this is, to break things into multiple lines. But the interpreter will still see this as all one line. So I find this helpful just to sort of like break it down so that I'm clear about what I'm doing. So this first line just literally enables, this is from code from before, it just says turn the -90, change our hue to a -90 degrees at 1 second, 3 second, 5 second, and 7 second, but only for a second each. And then while we're doing that, let's rotate and let's crop into that rotation, right? So these are the two examples we looked at before, and it's just combining these two into the same exact video filter. So this is just one way to produce, a single video from this. Like last week, we might have looked at doing this in 2 steps, like setting one as the input as the output, and then setting the output back again as the input. And again, it's whatever you feel comfortable with, but this is a little bit easier, and that it produces only one video output. And here we go. Here's my error divisible, not divisible by 1 or divisible by 2. So I assume what I'll have to do here is I'll just add 1 here. And then I'll need to add -y. If you ever get that, like, are you sure we want me to overwrite a file? It's probably easier to just add -y to the end of your command. This will always overwrite. This will just like assume you want to overwrite your video file. So we'll just run this. That's interesting. Not divisible. Oh, it's probably because I need to wrap all of this, right? Yep, there we go. And so here we have a nice little like hue blinker. So this is, this is starting to get pretty complex, right? Like we're starting to do multiple filters. We're using an enable timeline support. We're also then like, calculating the right output width and output height for this. So you can get really, really powerful with just using single combined and chained video filters. So I definitely recommend, playing with this as what else can you add? Do you want to add in scaling, or do you want to add in other things that we've learned? Or maybe you want to dig in and play around with some other new filters. Maybe you want to add a blur or some other filter feature with this stuff. So that sort of wraps up like video filters. We will probably come back to lots of video filters because they're sort of the key for everything we're going to do. So we'll definitely look at more of them. But for now, I want to move on to complex filters unless there's other questions.
Derek, do you have a sense of why? I guess I'm trying to understand why like the rotate filter would include cropping as a feature as opposed to just having people crop appropriately according to how they want to deal with their rotation. Like
So
are there lots of commands where they've also added in additional capabilities for that repeat what other commands do?
So my guess is that the reason they did it in rotate is because rotation, a non-90 degree rotation, almost assumes you require some sort of crop. Like by default, it requires a crop. And my guess is that if we were to actually look at the rotate function, let me just click here and let me just do rotate. Oops. My guess is that there might even be a default for output. It doesn't look like it says there is, but my guess is you could just ignore it and it would try to figure out what it's supposed to do. I wouldn't be surprised if some of this is also like error checking. Like if people just throw in rotation and don't set the crop, then like FFmpeg already has to decide what to do. So it is kind of funky that like sometimes you have to figure out like, is there also a crop? Is there not? So my guess is it's not super common, but in this case, it just maybe makes sense because, well, you're rotating a video format, you have to figure out how to crop it anyway. So just tell us what you want to do. The other nice thing is that in this case, if we go back here, you could actually use output with, I guess, you could probably use this as a variable, right? So like, I don't know what that would look like, but you could probably use it as some sort of variable. So by embedding these in this like function, essentially you could also use that crop as some way of like actually implementing or playing with things. And there's also an input widths, right? So like you could also just utilize that as a way to do something. Again, I don't know what people would do with it, but I'm sure in some ways you could. So yeah, it's just like more flexible, I guess.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to start developing a logic, and I don't know if that's a mistake or not.
I would probably say, this is an open source tool with lots of developers working on it. So there's logic per developer, but like across the whole system, there's probably conventions, but no hard logic would be my guess, just based on what I've seen of the tool. Yeah. Any other questions about video filters? All right, so let's move on to complex filters. So the difference between a video filter and a complex filter is sometimes apparent, but also sometimes not apparent. I would describe complex filters as anytime you're working with multiple inputs or multiple outputs, or if you're even trying to take this a single input, but do something like sort of multiple inputy with it, which gets a little confusing, but we'll look at some very obvious examples immediately. But the idea of a complex filter is that it allows you to do these sort of chaining things, but also to specify what video should have what done to it, or what video file and what audio file should have things done to it. So we looked at like one example would be, let's say you have a video with audio in it. You would want to do something on the video side and then something on the audio side. You could actually do these all in one with a complex filter. So filter underscore complex is how you call that. And then what you could actually do is you could say 0, which is referencing the first video. You could say video. So this says the video from this. You do whatever. And then you save that out as 0.video. And then you could also do something with the audio file separately. So this is also really powerful in that, again, we're just sort of combining different functions into things. You could do whatever you want with here, and then you also save it back out. And then you could save that whole thing out as output. So complex allows you to like basically sort of work with multiple filters all at once. And as we'll see, it's really powerful, and it will make certain things that we've already looked at in this class, like doing that slicing and then pasting them back together, a little bit easier. It takes a little bit of getting used to, just getting used to sort of the syntax and trying to break down how our things are working. But you may find it's easier for you to understand, and you may find it's harder, and you may find like in the right thing it makes sense, and other things it doesn't. So let's take a look at a really, really simple example. So in this case, we are going to use the overlay filter. And what the overlay filter does is it takes two inputs, and it overlays them one on top of each other. So I'm just going to upload an image here really quickly. Where did my image go? Here we go. So I've got an image here. I'm just going to drag this and upload it to Colab. And so here what we're going to do is we're going to specify multiple inputs. So we're going to say first off is our video. And next is our image. And what we want to do is we just want to overlay the image on top of the video. So the way to do that is to specify the overlay function. And then what you want to do is you want to pass in two variables into that, right? So in this case, 0 references the first input. So it references the video file. And then 1 references our image. So what this is going to do is this works in a stacking order. So bottom is first, top is next. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the video, that goes on the bottom. We're going to take the image and stack it on top. Now overlay does take some additional functions, which we'll look at below. But for now, let's just run this. And you might be thinking, well, like, how is it going to know how long the image should show for? How is it going to, like, this is kind of the beauty of FFmpeg, it's just going to figure it out. And in this case, what it's going to do is it's going to take the image and it's going to display the image for as long as the video is shown for. So we'll go ahead and run this. And one thing you might notice is that usually your filter syntax goes input then your video or audio filter, and then an output. You don't need to specify an output if the output is going directly to this file. So you might see in other places where we go, combined, like we might name this video like this sort of internal video combined. Then we would have to do this thing called map, and then we have to like map this to the right video channels. So in general, I find that if you just leave this empty, you let FFmpeg figure it out. So let's just take a look at what this does. So here we go. I have an image just flat sitting over top of my image or over my video. So this is how you can do watermarking really easily. So what you can do is you can just upload like a semi-transparent PNG, and you can just do watermarking. Super easy. This is probably what, besides video like reformatting or re-encoding, that's probably like the next most popular thing to do in FFmpeg is slapping your logo on a video so that no one can download it and just use it. So it's important to think about like how you can't actually do this with the basic video filter, right? Like how would you specify 2 inputs in a video filter? It's actually very hard. So this is where the filter complex comes in. There actually is, I almost regret saying this, there is a way to bring in video, to bring in a second input in a video filter. Don't do it. It's just like really, it's like, you can do it, but it's like really, this is easier to understand than that is, I think. So this is, just getting our feet wet into how the complex filter works. So it's important to just remember like how these sort of variable keys work, is that 0 is always referencing the first input, 1 is referencing the next. So if you had 3 in here, dash, let's say image2.png, dash I space, you could actually do 0 and 2. I think this will throw an error message because if the second input isn't being used anywhere, it's just going to kind of be like, what do you want me to do with this? So don't quote me on that. Actually, let's just run it and see. Oh, well, okay, that can be a different error, but I do think you need to use all of your inputs. So David asked, this won't resize the image. That's correct. But we could look at how to do that in a minute, because that's the beauty of a complex filter graph, is this is where you can begin to say like, okay, well, with this input, do this, with this input, do this, and then combine them all together in like basically one line commands. So it's really important, or like once you start to understand how this works, you'll find it super powerful. And all that stuff that we did last week of like spit out 10 videos and then use all those as inputs in another place, you don't need to do that anymore. One other thing, I won't run this cell, but if you are interested in seeing a little bit more about how overlay works, let's say we wanted that video directly, or we wanted the image directly in the center of the video. Overlay does also take a X position and a Y position. And this is where it gets a little crazy. Capital W is the first input's width. Lowercase w is the second input's width. So, now you're starting to like get uppercase, lowercase stuff going on. This is where FFmpeg is both fun and really convoluted. So, but this will essentially just center your video. So I keep saying that, center your image. So the overlay does take a positional function as well. And David, your question about like, how would I do this if I wanted to resize that image? So this is where it gets kind of fun, is that you could then say, so before we do any of this, let's just take that first image. So we'll take 1 and we'll say scale equals, and let's say we want it to be 240, and then whatever the height of that should be. And then we can save that back out to our actually what I would do is I would probably save this to V1, or like, let's say I1. So we'll save this out to a variable called input1. And then what we would do is we would then set the overlay to use input1. So now you're also seeing like ways in which you can chain things in a really dynamic way. One thing to note is, this is again where it gets confusing. VF, to chain a VF, you use a comma. To begin to chain the complex filter graphs, use a semicolon. So the reason for that is because you can actually do multiple filters inside of this. So let's say I also wanted hue equals H equals -90. You could then do multiple filters, multiple video filters inside of your complex filter. It makes sense, but it's like there's just all these little things you have to worry about. Like, when do I use an equal sign? When do I use a colon? When do I use a comma? When do I use a semicolon? So I just sort of like skipped ahead to show like a more like dynamic example, but you can get really, really cool things going on with these. And so Stefan asks, there's no upper limit on overlays. So we'll come back to that. The challenge with overlays is that you always have to have two. So you can only have two inputs. So what you end up having to do is chaining a bunch of overlays together, which we will definitely look at in this class because that is a thing that I do a lot of. So it's important to remember like how many inputs. There again, like this is where something like your filters here is really important because I believe if you go to overlay, yep, so you'll see overlay takes two videos in. So it always has to be two videos. So if you want to do more than two videos, you have to begin to start to chain them together. Okay, so where was I? I was here. So let's take a look at a slightly more complex example. So again, this is where I find, breaking these up into individual lines helps it be a little bit more readable. So usually what I'll do is I'll just throw all of my inputs into a single line, and then I'll add the filter complex. And then usually what I do is I break every one of these components onto its own line, just so it's a little more readable, right? So, okay, so let's try to break down what this does. So we have one input, and we're going to run a command called split, which so split could maybe mean two things. One, it could maybe mean split the video into different components, right? Like take half of it, take another half of it. Split in this context actually means duplicate. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our video and we're going to create two versions of it. We're going to create one called V1 and one called V2. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take V2 and we're going to scale it down by 50%, right? So we're going to use the input width divided by 2, and then we're going to do -1. So it's just like do 50%, and then we're going to save that back out as V2. So you can save these variables back out to themselves. I'm not sure that you could set this to 1. That might actually not be possible because I believe those zeros and ones are designated for the inputs, but don't quote me on that. I tend to find this just makes the most sense to me, is that, split this out into two channels or two separate video files, do one thing with them, and then we're going to take V2 back in and we're going to add it as an overlay. So we're basically going to take our two videos. We're going to, so basically like you will often see people describe these in these filter graphics, right? If you're used to Grasshopper or other like sort of chaining node editors, like this probably looks very common to you. But basically this is what's happening, right? So we're taking our input, we're splitting into two files. We're taking the second file and we're scaling it down, saving it back out, and then we're combining them again using overlay. So this is kind of like a really simple example because it just takes but what's cool here is you have the same singular input, right? So we're only working off one video file, and we're going to do multiple things to that single video file. So let's go ahead and run this. Oh my God, Sarah was right.
It's my favorite sentence in the whole world.
I know it is. That's why I said it. And this will be recorded.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go for it.
So the split, is that just basically creating a copy of the same video and giving you two inputs?
Yeah, I assume so. I don't really know how FFmpeg works behind the scenes. Like, I don't know what the performance of this is or like, how it really visualizes this, but essentially that's what it's doing. It's just making a copy of it.
Okay.
And then it's taking that copy and you can then do different things with different copies.
Cool. Thanks.
So let's download this and take a look. And so there we go. Same video, and all we did is just stack one on top of each other after we scaled one of them. So now all of my tricks have been revealed to you. Like this is everything that I've done up so far up to this class. So we're just stacking. Is split a V? Oh, so David, take a look. Let's take a look together. This is a good learning moment. Split. You'll see here has a V to an N. So N means it could be more than one or more than two. And we will look at an example of that. So that's a great point that again, you can look at sort of as you learn each of these filters, you have to like go and look up like what do they do, what variables do they take, that sort of thing. As an aside, you can also save out each one of these pieces separately if you wanted to. So again, this is probably a thing where like, let's say you work at Vimeo and someone uploads a video and you want to create a bunch of different sizes that can then be displayed on mobile or whatever. Like this would probably be the command that someone would use. So what you do is you just save each one of these out with their various names, right? So V1 and V2 are the like outputs here. And all you do is you do a map feature. So you do map and then you give it V1 and you say V1 should output to this file, and then map V2, V2 should output to this file. So if you do ever want to do multiple outputs from a complex filter, it's fairly easy with this. I think it gets a little bit more complicated when you start to add in audio, but I can look at that because we will look at a little bit of an audio example, maybe like the last week of class. So this is just an aside if you are interested in dumping out multiple video files. Okay, so now that we know hue, scale, yeah, so basically map says like, hey, take these things that we generated before and like map them to a file. I believe it always needs to have one video format or one video file. So you can't map multiple video files to a single file because I won't know what to do with that, but you can map multiple audio files if you have the right format. Okay, so in this class, we've now learned hue, scale, and overlay, and we've learned how to do complex filter graphs. So that video that I showed you at the first week of class that I was like, look how crazy this thing is, you should now be able to break this all down into pieces to be able to recreate that video. So 2 weeks in, we're already doing some really, really cool complex stuff. So let's go through this line one by one, and then we'll see what, actually, let me just run this and then we'll walk through it as it renders. Okay, so at the top here, we have our input video. So we're giving it one input video. The first thing we're doing is we're taking that video and we're splitting it into 4. So if you do equals 4, that means split it 4 times. So create 4 duplicates, or I guess create 3 duplicates. And then we're saving them out as C1, C2, C3, C4. All right, so C1, what we're going to do with C1 is we're just going to cycle the hue at 12 degrees per second. Pretty simple. The next channel, or the next video, we're going to do double that. So we're going to double the speed of the hue cycling, but we're also going to scale it down by 75%. And honestly, this is probably a little bit like, the way I would actually write this today would be this. This is just a little bit cleaner. Then we're going to take the third video, and guess what? We're going to double the hue cycling again, and we're going to scale it down a little bit more. Then we're going to take the last video, and we're going to do that all over again. So we'll double the hue again. We'll make the video even smaller. And then now that we've got all these pieces built up, now we can just combine them all in overlay filters. So again, Stefan, here's where you need to do your like chaining of overlays. So you take C1, you stack C2 on top of it. And we're going to set C2 to be in the right location, which is centered. Then we're going to take C2. Okay, so we're going to generate all this and save it out to C2. So we're going to take C2, which is this generated like stacked version. We're going to take that as the underlying, then add C3 on top of that, save that out as C3, and then take C3 again and stack C4 on top of it. And at the very end, we should get this. So this is really powerful, right? Like this would actually be fairly okay to do inside of After Effects, but it still wouldn't be my favorite thing to do, right? Like it's going to like create duplicates of things, like scale them down to the right size, move them around. This code is now reusable, right? Any video I put in here is going to do the exact same thing. It's going to auto scale. It's going to auto hue rotate. So now I've got a cool little video package. Like I can spend like 30 videos through this thing and they all do the same thing. And it's really, really fun to play with. And the truth is, now that we know how these filters work, this isn't really that hard. And the other fun thing is that now this is flexible, right? There's a thing called VFlip. So let's say I want to take the second video and I want to flip it vertically. And let's say the fourth video, instead of doing a VFlip, let's do an HFlip. So now I'm like combining in all these little things in here, and it's starting to feel, it's going to feel really complex when I actually run this. It's going to start to feel like, oh, how did you do that? Like that's so different. Like, you know, and all we're doing is we're building up little filters here and there and creating this really complex system using really simple individual filters. Right? So now it's not just like, oh, you're clearly like duplicating that file. Now you're doing some fun things that like, you know, some people might be able to quickly figure out and other people won't. And all I did was just like swap in one filter or two filters into two different places, right? This is again where I think something like rotate would be really fun. If you do rotate, let's actually look at this. So rotate equals, man, I've already forgot what rotate takes in. What is it? Oh, it's always radians, right? Is that right? It's always radians. Let's just grab one of these. So grab this. And we'll paste this in here. And actually, let's do transparent would be, is transparent FF or 00? 00? Is that right?
I think so.
Think so. Okay, let's try it. I am so bad at hex codes. So let's try this. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to take the second layer and we're going to rotate it. And I think we're going to set the output width. This might get a little gnarly. Let's see if this is actually going to work. Because I think we might have to set the output width of everything to be this, but let's see if FFmpeg just figures it out. Unable to apply. Oh. Okay, let's do this. Let's apply this to our base video and see if that helps make this work. Nope, still not. Oh, missing A. Sorry, where am I missing A? Oh, missing A. Ah, that. Yep, okay, thanks. Oh, it does. Okay, so maybe it was just my stupidity that was causing the error, which is just such a common thing, right? All right, let's see if this works. Oh, I have a feeling this is gonna get mad at me. It'll be fine, but like I've got a transparent background on my final output, which is gonna be a little weird. Let's see how it interprets that. Oh, interesting, I just flattened it. Okay, so now obviously this is a little funky because like I think these positions maybe stayed in the same place, but we could maybe like, I'm just gonna freestyle here and just see where we end up with this. So let's make this one negative. Let's make this one positive again. And let's make this one negative. Okay, well, something still failed there. I'll come back to this and look at it. Probably there's something wrong with like setting inputs and outputs heights on like within these. But again, I think here's where you could have a lot of fun, right? Like just with these 4 pieces, C2 isn't at the end. There you go. That's what it was. Thank you. All right, let's see if this works. But anyway, I think this is just like, you can have so much fun just within this dynamic, right? Like just take these 4, oh my God, you're killing me here. Why does the console do that sometimes? Just within this section alone, there's so much you could do, right? Like just with these 4 pieces stacking, there's so much you could do. And I think this is where like you can just have a lot of fun with these pieces and just sort of play around. So even if you're like kind of confused by everything going on around here, just play within this like sort of playground within these 4 videos. So C1 is your first video, C2 is your second video, C3 is your third video, and C4 is your fourth video. And those are just the stackable layers. You can play with how big the scale is or how small the scale is. Again, I don't think we could use a T variable here because I don't think that the video can change size, but who knows? There's probably a lot that we can find out about what works and what doesn't. So you're now pretty much at a point where like, I don't know, you still need me because we're gonna look at more fun things in this class, but you could probably like call it quits today if you wanted to and just like have fun and play around with filters. I feel like I've given you, oh, here we go. Ah, that looks really cool. I feel like I want the whole thing to crop so that you don't see the background, but just like the stacks. I think that'd be fun. So maybe I'll look at that a little bit later. But yeah, I mean, this is like just the basic fun of like using these tools is that now you've got all the little pieces and you're just building up little pieces, right? Whereas like honestly doing this inside of open frameworks or like processing, you'd have to write a function for every one of these little things and then make sure they play nicely together. So it's kind of fun that you don't even have to worry about that. You're just using built-in filters that already exist. So that's a complex filter. I think there's probably way more you could do with this. And I definitely encourage you to think about like, you know, what other things can we do? Like we looked at HStack and VStack last week. You know, what else can we do to like combine stuff in like a grid format using all of these other video filter tools? Any questions about this? Okay. So again, I'm running a little long on time here, but I do want to talk a little bit about the bonus thing that I feel like the bonus is always like, how do I combine this with Python? And I want to show one example here, which I think is really interesting because this sort of shows both the limitation of FFmpeg, but how we can actually make this a little bit more powerful by connecting FFmpeg and Python together. So there is a filter in here in FFmpeg called RGBA shift. It's probably, you know, you probably have seen that effect of like, you know, shifting various like layers of RGB a little bit to create sort of that like trippy effect. So that's doable inside of FFmpeg. The way to do it is just to use the RGBA shift, and then there's a BHBV RHRV GHGV. So each of those stands for, you know, each individual channel, horizontal and vertical. So if you were to do multiple of these, like say you want to do the GH, you would do GH equals like 50. So this is going to shift the B channel vertically by 100 and shift the green channel horizontally by 50. So you think, wow, this is really cool. Let me go and throw the T variable in here, right? So you're going to go do this, and you're going to be like, this is going to be really cool. I'll animate the variable shifting by T. Whoops. And guess what? It says, nope, you're not going to do that. And the reason you're not going to do that is because for some reason, whoever built the RGBA shift thing didn't build in a way to do it with the timeline, with the T variable, right? So all of a sudden you're like, wait, what's the fun of this thing if I can't actually animate the shifting? That's kind of silly. So I'm going to quickly run through like what this thing does. So we're going to use Python to actually animate the RGBA shift. And the way to do that is we're going to import the math function. We're going to run through a range, right? So I know my video happens to be 8 seconds long. This is again a case where like it's probably helpful to know like just how long your video is. So we could do VL as video length. We get set to equal to 8. And we're going to do this. I also know my video is 24 frames per second. Actually, this video is not. This video is 30 frames per second. So for every frame in this video, what I want to do is I want to apply a cosine variable, or like I want to use cosine to actually shift my RGBA shift, right? So if you've ever used sine or cosine, you know it's a little bit more fluid than just like setting if-else statements. So you get a nice sort of waviness to it. So I won't cover this code too much, but it basically just uses where I am in the frame rate. So like, you know, and again, this should be 30. So I believe don't quote me on this, but I think every second it is going to animate sort of along a cosine curve. And we're going to use 75, so it'll be negative 75 to positive 75. So it should just shift like this. If you understand sine or cosine, you're welcome to like sort of play with this code to do different things with that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take that, and for every single frame, we're going to use the enable filter, and we're going to use the timeline filter with n. So we're literally going to say at every single frame, we're going to give it the exact position it needs to be in. So this is going to be pretty wild. We're then going to save that to a filter string. We're basically just going to save it to a string, and then we're going to feed that string into FFmpeg. So here I'm going to build up my string first. So I've now created a string that just says, you know, enable at this point with this value. At frame 1, I want it to be this value. At frame 2, I want it to be this value. At frame 3, I want it to be this value. And this will go on and on and on and on and on. You can see how long this string is, right? No one will write this string by hand. I guarantee you'll never want to write this string by hand. But we don't care. We don't need to write it by hand. So now here is the FFmpeg command. And what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the VF filter, and we're just going to pass in that entire command. So literally this is going to be like a frame by frame animation built in Python. And then we'll save this out. And I set this to BV is fine, I guess. And so you could even set up, like, let's say, okay, I want the BV value to be cosine. And let's say I want like another value to be, let's do amount 2. Let's say I want amount 2 to be sine instead of cosine. And then all you would have to do is you would have to do, I guess here you would add a plus, and then you would just say, like, let's say GH equals plus plus. Then you would just do string amount 2. And the only difference between this line and this line is this line accounts for having to do the comma. So basically say if it's the very first index, don't add a comma. If it's the very second, if it's everything after, add a comma. So you could build this up to be really, really cool and really powerful and create these really trippy wavy effects. So let's see, blue shift sine 2. So there we go. So you can sort of see the blue sort of shifts in and out. And so like now we've got like FFmpeg is kind of hampered, but because we know Python and because we can write strings, we can now combine these two into a way that like actually animates a feature that doesn't animate in FFmpeg. So this is really cool. This is really powerful. You know, maybe in 6 months, someone will actually fix the RGBA shift to actually work with the T variable. But today we can use this as is. So yeah, it's this would be hard with like, this would be harder to do with something like the command line. You'd probably actually have to dump this into a Python or a bash script, right? Or like some sort of Python scripting environment. This is why I like Colab, because Colab lets me do it here and it just runs. And clearly, like, you know, you have to upload stuff, you have to download stuff. Kyle, I'm not sure if there's actually, I'm not sure if there is. Or I've never hit it. I mean, we can make this, we could upload an hour-long video and see if we can do this on it. It'd be kind of funny to see how long that would work. But I don't think there is here. I think you can literally like spit this out as is. And that was still pretty performant, right? It didn't really take that long to generate that video. We were literally saying at every one of these keyframes, do this thing. It was literally every single frame of that video. We were animating something. So, you know, again, if you don't want to figure out T and you just want to like say, I want to like automate all of this, you could, and just spit it out in this way. And this, you know, timeline enable equals n is just saying like, I'm going to give you a frame and you're going to do a thing at this frame. So you could also try between, like, let's say you want to say like between these frames, like do this. You could use between here and then just like automate your sort of I variable to do various things with it. So I think all this stuff is really fun to play with, and I definitely recommend for homework, try a new filter or two that we haven't talked about this class. See if you can get it working. If you can't, drop a note in Slack and maybe we can figure out together. or come to the co-working session this week, and we can try to figure out together. And again, maybe think about how you can combine these things. Right now, we're using, in this complex filter, we are using the same video input. What if we use 2 or 3 video inputs? Could you almost create like a checkerboarding effect, or like, you know, begin to build these up as a stack in a really interesting way using multiple videos? Next week, or like maybe in the next week or two, like Chris, what I would love to do is also figure out can we shift each one of these videos, right? So a common thing you see with like slit scan or any other of these things, as you offset the video by like half a second for each one of them, you get this sort of like cool thing where they're like animating in slightly different phases. You'll get really interesting effects there. So if you want to try that, you can try that. That's gonna be a little bit trickier because combining or like offsetting video isn't actually as easy as you would hope it is inside of FFmpeg, but there are some ways to do it. So that's it for this week. Yeah, so if you can't make co-working this week, just let me know. I'm also happy to set up more time. So we'll do Monday and Wednesday this week, because I know Monday is a holiday for a lot of folks. So yeah, it's hopefully helpful that way. Yeah, and I'm also trying to move to like just sticking everything inside these notebooks. So all you can do is open the notebook and walk through it that way. Usually I have more slides. Like for week 1, I had a lot of like just slides, but like this time I'm just like, let's just play with some stuff. So we'll be doing more of that as we go forward as well. Any questions? I have to run in like 5 minutes, but if you have a quick 1 or 2 questions, I can try to answer them now. All right, cool. Well, happy art making. If you do make something cool, or if you're into a question, like please drop it in the Slack channel. It's always really fun to see people's work on there. Also, if you want to drop them on Twitter or Instagram and tag me, I'm always happy to share stuff. It's really fun. Some of the folks in the audit class were also sharing their work on Twitter, and I made sure to retweet because I think that I loved a couple of the things they were making. So I hope we'll see more cool stuff from people as everyone gets more comfortable with the tool. So yeah, that's it for today. So I'll see everyone next week, and hope you have a good week if I don't see you in a co-working before then.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.